Her. Bold. Brave. Her. With Dr. Pam Peeke.
Hi, I'm Dr. Pam Peeke, and this is episode 536 of the Bold and the Brave, Her podcast. Now, today I'm joined by Dr. Helen Epstein. Her PhD is in biology, and she has a very deep interest in public health. And we're going to be talking about something that I've never talked about ever in 536 episodes, ever. And that's the issue of suicide. And why am I even bringing this up in the first place? Because it really harkens to a very central trend that's going on in society that really revolves around connection with other people, loneliness, and really what has happened over the course of the last really 100 years in the USA, and lots of other global issues as well. And I just, it affects me. Raise your hand out there if it affects you. So many of us know people who have had this issue. And I really want to get to the heart of it with someone who has done an extraordinary job of looking at this closely and really coming up with updated metrics, et cetera. So Dr. Helen Epstein is visiting professor of human rights and global public health at Bard College. And she writes frequently for the New York Review of Books and other publications. And she just wrote a book called Why Live? How Suicide Becomes an Epidemic. This just came out. And I'm going to say that I have read a gazillion books. Of course, I've written a number of books, so I'm kind of in the book thing. And it's a rarity for me not to be able to put a book down once I open it. And this is what happened with this, because it's not what I expected. It was actually so compassionate and also objective, filled with metrics, and so well studied. I think the stories that were told were just absolutely amazing. So we're really going to kind of dive into some of this because you know something? This is the Her podcast, and it's about women, and it's about people in women's ecosystem, and how something like this affects us and how we might be able to reframe and redefine what's actually happening here. So, Dr. Helen Epstein, welcome to the Her podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
You wrote in the beginning of this extraordinary book, why, one of the reasons why you were so compelled to write about it. You're into public health. So am I, obviously. I have a master's in public health, public policy. So I'm all about epidemiology and, looking at trends and what goes on. But for me, it was always about disease. It's like, what's going on with measles and back and forth. And what you did was something really amazing. You took this whole issue of trends in suicide and you turned it on its head with some really beautiful work here. Now, you were inspired, as it were, by a suicide in your own life. Tell us about that.
Yeah. I am a teacher of public health to undergraduate students, and I'm always looking for interesting things to show my students. And I'd come across some papers about spate of suicides, a steep increase in the suicide rate among indigenous people all around the world, in fact. But particularly, I was interested in the indigenous people of the Arctic, the Inuit in particular. And around this time, and I was wondering what was going on, because suicide among these people had, especially among young people, had increased tenfold at least in the space of just a decade or two. And I was really mystified by this. And at the same time, around about 8 years ago, I lost someone, a good friend, to suicide. And I had known she was depressed, but I did not expect what happened. And I was really thrown by it, actually. And I looked into her background, and it turned out that a number of the families that she'd grown up with had also been affected by suicide. And I wondered whether she might have been part of one of these epidemics also. Of course, there's no science and no data to prove that, but it got me interested in asking whether my own field actually might be able to tell us something about this deeply tragic and mysterious phenomenon of suicide that looking at individual cases can't necessarily tell us. I mean, one of the things about disease, as you know, is we never know who's going to get sick tomorrow. We never know who will succumb to cancer or a heart attack or something like that. It's all their risk factors and so on, but we can never know for sure. Whereas with epidemics, they always happen for a reason. Any disease that affects large numbers of people or affliction of any kind, there's always a story behind it. You know, when there's a flu epidemic, it's usually in the fall when kids start going back to school and people are in close places, something like that. The lung cancer epidemic, cancer exploded in the United States after people started smoking in the 20s and 30s. So what was going on with suicide? I really wondered whether there was something in the air besides inside us that might be driving this, in addition to the internal factors, which so many others have described.
So you are looking for commonality. There was something happening here. One of the things that happens is that, when someone, does commit suicide, you look at it as a one-off. It's like, wow, what was happening with him and what's going on? And, but you were actually looking at really societal changes in certain, populations and back and forth. I think that, I just last week, I believe, I emailed you that Dr. Nolan Williams, he was a very prominent Stanford psychiatrist, was only 42 years of age. He was a leading researcher known for developing the Stanford Accelerated Intelligent Neuromodulation therapies called SAINT. And it was for treatment-resistant depression, right? And just absolutely saved people's lives, And son of a gun, October 8th, at the age of 42, with children at home and a wife, an incredible career. I knew of him, as so many of us did, because of his work, and we loved his research. He committed suicide. And in this case, and since I'm a physician, I oftentimes hear about other physicians and back and forth. And as you probably already know this extremely well, physicians have a very high rate of suicide relative to, the community at large. And, if you looked at Instagram, you had all these patients of his whose lives he saved. And they're like, what?
Yeah.
Wait a minute. You're the one who saved me. Why didn't someone save you? What's going on? So we're always left when it comes to suicide with a big question mark. Unless it was super obvious, you're a Wall Streeter, you were found to be fraudulent, and you were about ready to face 50 years in the slammer. It was pretty clear you're going to get indicted, blah, blah. And, that's kind of one of those, okay, he jumped out of a window and he didn't want to face the music, and there's all that. Okay, I think a lot of people kind of, categorize that. And then you have this extraordinary young researcher, you know, and
Yeah.
you just have to take a moment. So where does all this fit in the context of what you were writing about?
Yeah. I mean, that's the mystery, is that with any given person who takes his own life, one thing, we can't really know what's going on in the labyrinth of their mind. One thing to know is that what we do know about people who attempt suicide and also those who go on to complete it is that they are suffering deeply, profoundly, and that very often for a large number of people with who do take their own lives suffer from mental illnesses, for one thing. So they may be under a delusion, a mistaken delusion that no one cares about them and that they fit in nowhere. There is this deep feeling, I think, so I gather, and so I partly know from my own experience, having once felt this way, that there is this profound feeling that I know when I felt. I had taken some antidepressant medications, which kind of backfired, and I felt very profoundly that everyone in my life would be better off without me, and that even at that time, I was working on some epidemiological projects in Africa, and I somehow felt they would go better too without me. And there it was. This was an effect, I think, of the medications. I mean, I was obviously not happy about a bunch of things, but those drugs can have that side effect in some people. They have also saved large numbers of lives. They're amazing drugs, but they can also. With some people, they don't work so well. But it did give me this insight into what people with suicidal feelings feel. And this has also been backed up by research. There's a psychologist called Thomas Joyner who's written quite a bit about suicide, and he writes about these feelings of a lack of belongingness and a feeling that you're a burden to others. These are the two feelings that seem to be so common in his suicidal patients and in studies of suicidal patients that he and others have carried out. It's very much a profound thing. And people can have that feeling for a lot of reasons. There's your stockbroker who screwed up, and it may be, there may be a grain of truth in what he feels, but or there may, in fact, be people who care about him, but he's so upset with himself that he can't see that, which is more likely. And there are people who, for whom there seem to be no reasons for these kinds of feelings, but they feel it anyway. And that's the mysterious, that's the mystery of it. That's the, I don't know.
I wonder. I've had a bias in the back of my mind, and we're going to get to the whole issue of women and suicide because I think this is her podcast, so I really want to get to that. And this also involves women as well, what I'm going to say. I've often wondered, what the literature shows about highly brilliant people and suicide. It's almost as though they don't fit into the world, because of their brilliance or whatever. I'm thinking of David Foster Wallace, who was afflicted with pretty bad depression most of his life. And Lord knows people loved this guy. I mean, you cannot say he lived in like isolation and nobody cared about him. I mean, my God, he just... one of the most brilliant minds I had ever encountered, and I think, it's true perception of so many people out there, Sylvia Plath. It's almost as though they're too brilliant. I don't know. I'm sounding weird here, but go there with me. What's this thing about brilliance and the oftentimes inability to be able to just exist, as so many people do. What do you think?
Yeah, in fact, has been in the 20th century, and there's even a book about it, about the large numbers of suicides, particularly among writers, 20th century writers. And there are many others come to mind, Hemingway and so on, as well as Plath and Wallace. And I think it's a tricky one, because what I was very struck by, and it's this kind of a conundrum that I try to deal with in the in Why Live, which is that I spoke with a considerable number, a few dozen former military veterans, who all of whom had experienced suicidal feelings at one time or another, and many of whom had made attempts and come very, very close to taking their own lives, ended up in the hospital and so on. And they'd all managed to kind of get through it and find some meaning in life somehow. And I was very interested in how they'd done that, what had helped them. And of course, connections with other people mattered. But what also mattered, and what also seemed to give them a lot of hope and solace and so on, was artistic expression. So, and particularly the declamatory arts like theater and poetry. And a lot of them, some of them had written memoirs, which was also useful to me. There's this paradox. On the one hand, people who have experienced suicidal feelings find solace in art. On the other hand, as many people have written, as Tolstoy wrote about that also, his wife Sonia was deeply depressed after the death of one of her children, and he was astonished by how she found solace in listening to music. And he then wrote a short, kind of cantankerous book called What is Art? And it was really about how art involves reaching into one's interior somehow and transforming one's darkest feelings into something that you can share with the world. And I think, so there is this feeling that I think people who experience and have, deep ambivalence about life and difficulties with it are also drawn to art and find solace in it, but sometimes that solace is not enough. And so we end up, and that's the only explanation I can think of for that paradox, the impulse to do art among people who have struggled with depression and suicide, and at the same time, the preponderance, the large numbers of suicidal artists. Rothko is another, for example. And it makes you, when you think about Rothko, I mean, those paintings begin to make a different kind of sense when you know how he really felt. Those are moods. Those are, kind of layers of moods and so on.
I did my residency at George Washington University, and I would go over to the Smithsonian all the time. And at the Hirshhorn, they would always have some beautiful Rothko, and I would just sit there. They would have that beautiful bench in front of them, and Rothko was one of my favorites. And then once I learned more about him, I began to understand. You're absolutely correct. No question about it. I just go back to the brilliance thing. I think everyone needs to kind of go back in their life and, think about how it touched their lives. I never knew anything about this until I was in medical school, and there was a surgeon who came on board, and he was beyond brilliant. I mean, he was probably one of the best teachers ever. And what he would do is take forever and a day in surgery because he wanted to show, the students, the residents, whatever, every single layer of fascia that he went through. Whereas the nurses were going out of their minds because they were like, can we just get out of here already? But he saw his surgery as art. he just absolutely couldn't get enough. I appended myself to him. I said, "You call me at any time of day or night, and if it's humanly possible, I'd like to be one of your assists in surgery because I'm learning so much I can't stand myself." And I really became. I mean, he became an incredible mentor. But what was happening was he was getting pushback from people who just said, "Can we just get in and out of here?" It was something we call skin to skin. From the moment you cut skin to the moment you sew it up, it's like, let's do it. An appendectomy should be 30 minutes skin to skin if it's an easy one and whatever. And he never saw it that way. He saw it as art. And, it was so interesting. He had a couple, either 2 or 3 sets of twins. It's the craziest thing. Beautiful wife, gorgeous children, and one day he was found hanging in his garage.
Wow.
And it crushed me. It was the first time in my life, and it was very hard for me. I was so young. I mean, my God, I was just in my 20s, and I didn't understand how this whole thing works.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why I've been fascinated with it. And Lord knows, because the suicide rate's so high in physicians, I'm constantly hearing about it, whether I like it or not, either people I know or people I know of, or, back and forth. So it's just one of those things where I wonder, I truly wonder. There's one time that really haunted me, and I was in the trauma center, and there was a young Black surgical resident, and that's really rare at that time. And it was a young woman, and which made it even more rare. She was so bright. She was amazing. We kind of, palled up. I'd see her in the ER, and I'd do a lot of favors for her, just trying to help her move some of these patients along to the OR and whatever, and back and forth. And I noticed at one point she was just getting more and more quiet. And I wondered about it, but remember, I'm living in the chaos of a trauma center. It's not like, hey, let's go out for lunch and talk. It's just I never had the opportunity. And right up there in her bunk, in the on-call room, she committed suicide.
Wow.
And I had to sit with that one for a long time. Once again, don't people sit back and say, what could I have done?
Everyone thinks that. You want to always thinks that. And that's, it haunts us all who've been touched by this issue. We can never know who will be affected by suicide. I mean, there are many, many, many depressed people. One sign is that quietness. And I noticed that in my friend too. And I knew she was depressed, and I kept trying to urge her to speak, but she would kind of go silent, as though she were kind of overwhelmed by emotions that she could not sort out and understand herself. And that's possible that may be what was happening with your colleague, the young Black doctor, who was also, it sounds like, as the surgeon, was a pioneer. And being a pioneer is a really lonely thing. So even if there are people around you, they may not necessarily understand what your challenges may be. And you're always, as a doctor, you're expected to be the strong one.
Oh gosh, yeah.
So
I think that's one of the we're not supposed to show anything. Like, don't ask me to be a human being. I'm here to help you. I was trained old school. You never talk about yourself, ever. Instead, it's always about the patient all the time. So it kind of like, whoa, okay. So we would have to, it's like being pent up, in a big way. Now, when we come back, we're now going to pivot to women, and we're going to look at the whole issue of what's going on with women currently intergenerational. We're going to go with young, with older, etc., and try to understand the context within which we're talking, within the ecosystem of society, where we live, who we make contact with or don't make contact with, and how we can maybe reframe this to help ourselves and to help people we love. All right, when we come back. The Her podcast is sponsored by Solaray Vitamins, Minerals, and Herbs, all rooted in nature. In addition to women's multivitamins, Solaray, Solaray, is presenting the new Her Life Stages products, providing support for the menstrual years, including PMS, perimenopause, menopause, and postmenopause, and even libido. This integrative, holistic approach has a woman's back throughout her entire life journey. To learn more about Her Life Stages, you've got options. You can run on over to your local health food store or check it out at Whole Foods, Sprouts, Amazon, or scroll over to solaray.com and use promo code HER20 for 20% off your purchase. Women, Solaray's got your back. And we're back. All right, now let's get on over to women. Oh my gosh. So there's a difference between men and women when they're considering something like ending their lives. And by the way, when I talk about the ending your life thing, I want to be very clear about something else. What we're talking about here is different than if you were diagnosed with a terminal illness. That's different. The whole world is different. And so that's a whole different category. I'm talking about people, like David Foster Wallace and other people just kind of hanging out and doing their thing. And here's this fabulous psychiatrist hanging out, doing his thing. And, they end it. So let's talk about women. What's the difference between how women and men, as it were, frame this issue of ending their life?
Yeah. Well, in most of the world, actually, where we see, where we have statistics on suicide, which is nearly everywhere these days, men are much more likely to take their own lives than women are. And usually, I don't know, it varies, 3 or 4 times more, sometimes even more. The ratio can be even greater than that. There are exceptions, and they're extremely informative, and I'm going to talk about those in a minute. But it's kind of makes sense because I think part of the reason why we see suicide epidemics in some communities, what seems to spark them is a sudden transition of modernization, essentially modernization of societies from more traditional societies that are really based on subsistence, sharing, strong moral norms, where generosity is a particularly strong value, where people will have to rely on each other because there's no state around there, there's no social security, there's no police, there are no pensions. Essentially, you have to rely on family, kin, and community to get along in life. And so, nobody really keeps track of who owes what to whom. What matters is whether you are someone that other people can rely on. And whereas in more modern societies where we've kind of boiled everything down to competition and where really one's worth in so many cases boils down to cold hard cash, and where every transaction is kind of valued down to the penny, and where we live in these rather cruel hierarchies, that's where you see spikes in suicide. It's the transition from one type of world to another type of world. So in these indigenous societies where we see suicide crises that are just staggering, especially among young men all around the world. These societies have all undergone fairly recently, meaning since World War II or since the turn of the 20th century, this transition from these more traditional communities to harsher forms of society. And when that happens, people of both genders or all genders find themselves, can find themselves lost. They don't quite know where they fit. And it's a particular problem for young men because in the past they would have helped their fathers build canoes or igloos or whatever it was. And now they're sort of supposed to go to school and all of this is rather, and get a job, all of which is kind of unfamiliar in their culture. And they don't quite know where they fit in. For young women, I think, are a bit more protected from this in most cases because they have natural roles of housekeeping and taking care of kids, and they can look forward to sort of marriage and those kinds of roles. And so they often are better able at enduring these broader transitions. Having said that, there is an exception, or there was an exception. It's changed now, but China was a big exception to this because there the suicide rate among young women was much higher than among young men.
Really?
Yeah. For a long time. That's not true anymore. But it was true for a very long time. And it was something like 4 times higher. It was remarkable.
Why?
Well, the reason was that women in Chinese society were traditionally not valued. They're valued now, but in traditional Chinese society, having a girl was a very disappointing thing to do because you had to pay a dowry to get her married, which means, unlike in, say, Africa and other sort of traditional societies where you have a daughter, you can get money for her if you manage to marry her off, or you get cattle or you get something in return. In China, it's the other way around. Ditto India also. So a girl wasn't necessarily valued within her birth family because she was going to be a burden. She was also, once she got married, she went off with that dowry and she didn't necessarily help you. Sons were the ones who carried on the household. So people wanted sons. So already girls were kind of less valued in their families and tended to be mistreated and so on. And then when they went to go live with their husbands and in-laws, they were also treated often like slaves and abused, and they had no one to protect them. And they felt profound loneliness. I'm just a burden. I don't belong here, and so on. And so that was really the reason for it. And that societal prejudice against women became, in a way, kind of expressed in very high rates of selective infanticide, even of girls, and then later selective abortion when it became possible to determine the sex of a child before it was born. And also fairly high rates of after the one-child policy came in China in 1980, a lot of girls were abandoned to orphanages and then adopted abroad. So China ran kind of low. It's still running, for a long time, was running low on women. And the sex ratio in China has now really shifted. There's usually in a society, there's slightly more women than men. But in China, there's massively more men than women. And now women are valued.
Yeah, well, it's a karma thing, see what you did? So there you have it. I'm looking at the United States right now. Tell me about women over the age of 50, 60, et cetera. What's going on there? Because we now have so many more. Obviously, it's a huge demographic now, and very soon it'll be the majority. We'll have more people over the age of 50, 60 than younger people. I'm not quite sure what year that's going to be, but it's coming up. And, you know, you have a lot of loneliness.
You do.
You have a lot of widows, divorcees, split up families. It's not all. And I'm wondering, what do the metrics look like for people who are older? And is it skewing more toward men or women?
It's still, I think at that age, it's still more men who take their own lives. There are two bumps in the time of suicide, I guess, in American life. First, around late adolescence, early adulthood, where there's a kind of increase in suicide, and also in middle age. And both women and men are affected by this, men more so. And then, of course, in old age, as people become ill and lonely and so on. So there's sort of three peaks, actually, in life throughout the life cycle of the average American. And I think at the moment, that's kind of the situation. Middle age being a particular time, the suicide rate does go down as people get into their 60s. And I think it's partly the troubles that workers face in particular that have caused a massive mental health crisis in the country. So that actually people at middle age, 40s and 50s, report and experience more physical pain than people in their 60s and 70s. So there does seem to be some kind of perception that something is really wrong with their lives.
Well, you're saying that what's happening then, and I remember reading this in the book and was taken with this, that there's a perception of physicality, of real pain there. And, this is something kind of up my alley because what you're really looking at is the stress of daily living. Everything from personal to professional to, just the whole gambit, really sets up in the human body a pro-inflammatory state. And therefore, anything that's going to be an itis, like an arthritis, a bronchitis, I go right down the list, it's going to light up because stress hormone links up with those receptors throughout the body. And if you activate stress hormone on a chronic basis, then watch out because you're going to actually feel that pain. And that really blew me away when I read that in your book because that made all the sense in the world, needless to say. And I'm just thinking, you also said that where you live, counts for so much because it's part of the ecosystem. So I'm thinking of all these people who are in middle age, also young people who are first coming out and trying to get into the city and to some kind of job and, whatever. That I think one of the loneliest places on the planet is a city. I know that sounds weird. It's like, but there's so many people. But it's a very lonely, I have just found it to be profoundly lonely. I could see it as such with people just running around with their face planted in their iPhone or yapping away on their iPhone, with their headphones in and whatever, not paying attention to people around them, not smiling, not connecting. There's that word connecting. But when you go to a smaller town, many times, you're going to see a lot more smiles and a lot more connection. And am I imagining that?
I think at the moment, America's loneliness crisis is actually distributed right across the country. And I think that the economic shifts that have taken place since the 1970s have partly upended that and uprooted a lot of communities that once, as large multinational corporations, have replaced the kind of community-based businesses that we used to see, instead of, the butcher and the groceries, the local grocery store.
And the guy who owns the coffee shop.
Exactly.
Not a Starbucks. It's a guy who owns a coffee shop.
Yeah. Yeah. And we now see these giant, strip malls and so on, or stores, strips and so on, that are owned by sort of remote corporations, and people feel much less of a sense of ownership. Their wages aren't as good, relatively speaking, to the economy. So people find it harder to survive on just one job. And it has created a lot of despair, and I think, one of the things about pain, physical pain, as is it's very subjective. You can't measure it. I don't know what your pain is like, and you don't know what my pain is like. And even I barely know what my pain is like. I mean, it's all it's a product of our brains, really, and how we interpret what's going on around us. And in some ways, I think people are internalizing, in a way, the loneliness and atomization that is really kind of right across the country, actually. And that it is coming out and causing people to experience pain in a deeper way than they might have in the past, when they were more embedded in their communities, when we felt stronger connections to larger numbers of people around us.
Yep. And my colleague Vivek Murthy wrote, he was the U.S. Surgeon General, and he wrote his fairly famous book about loneliness.
Right.
And really, at the end of the day, some of the metrics that they've crunched is that, living a life of loneliness is worse than smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. On your health in general, people think that there's no, like mind-body thing. Like, okay, you're lonely, but your body's doing just fine. No. Your brain, your mind, and your body are absolutely intricately connected. And so as one goes, so goes the whole mess. And this is why I embraced his book. I thought it was timely, and it was time for us to get away from, the pills and we have heart disease and this, and it's like, stop for a minute. Our entire ecosystem that we live in, whatever generation we are, has changed dramatically. And yet we haven't planned for that. So when my heart just goes out to young women trying to establish a meaningful relationship with somebody, both in terms of a friend, as well as, if you're beginning to look for a partner in life. I mean, how do you do that with everyone's face plastered to their, iPhones? And when the best relationship you can begin to conjure is a bunch of texting, and you don't even get on the damn phone with each other, and do you actually look at each other in person? I'm kind of happy I grew up at a time when none of that was going on. It was like in person, and that was your option. Okay. And looking at how we're redefining partnerships, is marriage even of consequence anymore? The whole issue of having kids, our fertility rate is in the toilet. My God, it's below 2 per couple. So it's like, I think it's 1.6 or, somewhere along those lines. And we're just like, what's going on here? And I also think you brought this up at some point, that what really helps and helped a lot of your veterans that you talked about and other people who were struggling was faith.
Yeah.
And I don't care what faith, but, faith in establishing a more spiritual connection, which they found life-saving and healing. Speak to that.
Sure. And I think many of them had become Buddhists, actually. That was the faith that seemed to resonate with most of them. Yeah. And that was, I think that there could be a number of reasons for that. I mean, the Buddhist faith actually includes in it a lot of methods of kind of detachment and also coping with and learning to accept contradictions and problems and so on. And it does offer a kind of a pathway towards peace and a recognition of how difficult life is, individual, personal life. And I think also meditation, if you can really do it, has an effect of kind of untangling certain, and they've actually, brain scans have shown this, of untangling certain negative thought patterns that we get stuck into when we can't get out of. Psychedelic drugs also have a similar effect to this, it's thought, in the sense that actually there are certain networks that tend to kind of fire when we're thinking about ourselves, in fact, that can get caught up into kind of loops of negative thinking. And psychedelics can kind of break that up, they think. The explanations at the moment, as far as I understand them, are kind of hand-waving, but they have been studied very intensely, and that does seem to be the effect. So, and meditation, deep meditation, has that effect as well. And you can see it in nuns and monks, so on.
David Lynch, the famous,
Sure.
director, has a David Lynch Foundation, and he was a practitioner of transcendental meditation for, my God, decades. And I know them extremely well. And Bob Roth is the head of the foundation. As you know, David Lynch passed away this year. And he went in. They've done published studies with veterans who have PTSD and are struggling, as you mentioned, and they actually utilize TM, and they do this actually in the military academies now, and it's a very simple, straightforward 20 minutes twice a day, and you don't think, you just go into restful alertness. And the brain scans show activation of the prefrontal cortex, which is sort of the CEO of the brain. Yet you are in restful alertness, and it helps to anchor. So I think I'm bringing this up, and I'm glad you have, to be able to show that there are tools out there to begin to address some of this. I know your book was not a book of psychology and, all the little tips, tools, and techniques. But what I grabbed from your book were the following. One, everyone look at your own ecosystem. How can you enhance that? How can you nourish if you already have it, and never, ever, ever let it just be abandoned? Like, oh, I don't have time for, coffee with you, or, whatever. Not going to pick up that phone and when somebody in need needs you and all the rest of it. It was the weirdest thing. Helen, I'm going to tell you something you can go ahead and share. After reading your book, which I did in one sitting, I'm pretty good, right? I went out and I was walking my German Shepherd, my beloved German Shepherd, who was sitting on one of my feet as we speak, right? And I remember smiling more to everyone I saw. You never know when a smile will light up someone's day, because you don't know anything about where they're coming from. Really, you think you do, but not really. But a smile, what's the worst that can happen? They don't smile back. Well, get over yourself then and just move to the next person, right? Smile, maybe take a moment and talk, like, hey, how's your pup over there? And how's life going? What's going on? And, so great to see you. And then I found myself compelled to pick up the phone and call several friends that I felt bad about, that I hadn't gotten back to in a more timely manner. And I told each one of them, something, you're really important in my life. And I want to thank you. And you just call me anytime you need me. If I'm a little sloppy here and there, then just give me a slap upside the head or something. But I'm trying. I'm a human being, right? Your book really affected me that way.
Great.
I was shocked. I was like, all I could think of was that word connection. Got to be connected. And connected in a meaningful way. Because you just don't know. And that's what Vivek Murthy said, the Surgeon General, in his book on loneliness. Reach out.
Yeah.
Crying out loud. If you're lucky enough to be able to, have people in your life, and you have a wonderful ecosystem, if you're feeling funky about things, reach out.
Yeah.
And if it's humanly possible to talk about it and whatever, there are resources. There truly are. I'm not saying you're going to save every human being in this world. That's not going to happen. And all we could do is our own part, in terms of advocating for ourselves, as well as really connecting with others and helping them too. Women are pretty good at establishing our little tribes. That's one of the reasons why men, end up struggling so badly, because they don't do the tribe thing. We do. We connect, and whether it's Bible study or it's mahjong, or we're going to go out there and kill each other on the pickleball court, or we're going to run together, walk together. That's also another reason why you said music was helpful, right? Well, fitness is a monster here. Now, when you have fitness, which is my favorite thing, you join a walking club, you join a hiking club, you go to REI and sign up for a whole bunch of their wild and crazy adventures, make new friends. You got to put it out there, and and if you feel afraid, just say, what's the worst that can happen?
Yeah.
You didn't find like the best friend of your life. So what? You learned some really cool things and you hung out. And try another one and another one. And it takes courage. It really does, to be able to do all of that. And that's why I ask everyone out there, to find some way to be able to do that, connect. I've watched the little gym tribes get together, and the tennis tribes, and the, just biking tribes, just hanging out tribes. You can find a tribe for yourself and try it out, trial and error.
Yeah.
And it's just the magic of having just a few meaningful connections in your life and then nourishing those, because it's work.
Yeah.
It's work to stay up with people.
Yeah, and it's trickier for men too. They find it harder to reach out in that way, and I think, and particularly these days, I think when there are less, the union movement has subsided so much. That used to be men's clubs, the Kiwanis, and all of that. Those kinds of community, and just the way communities have kind of atomized throughout the country have made it particularly difficult for men to connect in that way.
I completely agree, which is why, as we're winding this incredible conversation, I can talk to you all day. I want women out there, if you're feeling cool, and you're really pretty anchored and whatever, is there a guy in your life somewhere along the line, I don't care who it is, that maybe you can adopt? I'm just playing here. What I'm saying is, could you, kind of reach out a little bit and connect and make that happen? That happened the other day for me when a good friend of mine, her husband, she was complaining about the fact that he just stays home most of the time. He's retired law enforcement, and he just was feeling kind of like out of it since he had recently retired. And you know how you lose that meaning and purpose in life? And I said, I know someone who's retired law enforcement who would really be a great play date for him. It was a joke. And so we got it together, and it was like magic.
Oh, wow.
It was crazy.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Yeah, but you can facilitate these things because I'm sure as hell not going to be able to help them out with the law enforcement end of it. But if you know people, then put it to work in your own life. That's the way I like to look at it. Well, I can talk to you forever and a flippin' day. I have learned so much from this book. Everyone, we've been talking to Dr. Helen Epstein, and the name of the book is Why Live? How Suicide Becomes an Epidemic. And it's not a big, heavy, funky book. It is actually chock full of stories and of science that's been well researched. And it just really makes you stop and think. I just so highly recommend this book. Again, it's called Why Live? How Suicide Becomes an Epidemic by Dr. Helen Epstein. Helen, thank you so much for being on the Her podcast. And trust me, we're going to invite you back.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Real pleasure.
All right, Helen, keep up this incredible work. We just absolutely love it. All right, and now I want to take a moment also, in addition to thanking Dr. Epstein, to thank my sponsor, Solar Vitamins, Minerals, and Herbs that are all rooted in nature and the new Her Life Stages products. Scope them all out at Solaray, SOLARAY.com. Now take a moment, leave us a review because we love to hear from you. Everyone, this has been a production of Podcast Health. Got a little reminder for you. Boy, is that timely for what we talked about today. Your time in this world may be limited, but the things you can do with that time are not. How about you smile? How about you make a new friend? How about you make someone's day? So get on out there and seize the day. A little carpe diem, everyone. Thanks for being here.